My name is Russell Miller. I'm a journalist and a biographer, and I'm the author of Barefaced Messiah. The genesis of the book was that, as you know, Hubbard virtually disappeared from public view in the early 80s. And I was working for the Sunday Times magazine at this time, and I was very often in America, almost every month. And I suggested to the editor of the magazine that why didn't we see if we could find where Hubbard was? And the basis for this was that if we could find him, we had a worldwide scoop. If we couldn't find him, we had an even greater mystery. Where is L. Ron Hubbard? And so I started to do that. When I was in America, I would do a little bit of research about Hubbard and try and establish what kind of where he was. And I did quite well, actually. I mean, I knew he was in California. I knew he was north of Los Angeles, and I calculated he was somewhere not too far from San Luis Obispo. And that was as far as I took it at that time. And then one morning when I was at home in England, I heard on the news that L. Ron Hubbard had died. And so it was the end of that research, but or it became pointless to continue with the assignment. But I then had learned such a lot about Hubbard that I thought I would use that basic research material to turn it into a book. And that's how Barefaced Messiah came about. The fascinating thing about doing the research is that almost everything the church said about L. Ron Hubbard was a lie. All the fatuous claims they'd made for his youthful activities, and he'd travelled the world learning the secrets of life from wise men and lamas and etc., etc. It was all utter nonsense. And what was fascinating was that every bit of research that I undertook, every time I tried to check a fact of L. Ron Hubbard's life, it almost invariably turned out to be a lie. For example, he claimed to have lived on his grandfather's ranch in Montana, covering a quarter of the state of Montana. There was no ranch. It just didn't exist. I found the house where he grew up in Helena. It was a perfectly nice, modest little house, but it was far from a ranch. He didn't break broncos when he was a child. There were no broncos. I mean, the family owned one horse, an elderly horse. He wasn't made a blood brother of the Bikuni Indians, the Blackfoot Indians, because they didn't practice blood brotherhood. He didn't learn to ride before he could walk because there was nothing to ride. He wasn't the youngest Eagle Scout in America. I mean, he might have been, but I checked with the Boy Scouts Association of America, and they said, well, they didn't keep a record of the age of Scouts, so there's no way of knowing that he was the youngest Eagle Scout. But Hubbard was establishing very early on in his life the sort of fantasy that he created around himself for the rest of his life. So from an early age, he was clearly lying about himself and everything that he had so-called achieved. And when I then continued to discover other things that he claimed to have done, again and again and again, it was one lie after another lie after another lie. He claimed to be a nuclear scientist, utter nonsense. He claimed to have graduated from George Washington University, utter nonsense. He claimed to be an explorer, utter nonsense. He claimed, when he was younger, he claimed that he'd been travelling the East, learning the secrets of life, etc., etc. He didn't do that. His father was in the Navy, posted at Guam. Hubbard took 2 trips out there. One was an organised family visit to China, and the other was stopping off in China on the way to or from the United States. But it was absolutely typical of the way that he elaborated his life. And in his diaries, you could see in colouring his life, his own comments about himself. He said, I'll tell you a secret. I was born on Friday the 13th. It wasn't. The date of his birth was Monday. So he was a complete stranger to the truth. And perhaps the most fascinating part of all the research was when I got his war record. Now, the church said he was a war hero. He'd served in all 5 theatres of war. He'd won innumerable medals. But I got his entire war record through the Freedom of Information Act. It was a pile of papers about that high, huge pile of papers. And in it, you could see that he, far from being a war hero, he was a malingering coward who did his best to avoid action. The only time that he got command of a small submarine chaser, and he gave an interview to the papers before he'd actually taken to sea, saying, "Hey, these are fine little ships, and we're going to beat the Japs with these." When he took to sea on his first voyage, it was a sort of sea trial. He'd only been at sea 5 minutes when he discovered that 2 Japanese submarines were patrolling off the west coast of America and fought this heroic battle, dropping depth charge after depth charge after depth charge. A court of inquiry following this incident concluded there was no submarine, either 1 or 2. There were no submarines at all, and all of the depth charges that had been dropped probably did no more than kill a few fish. He was, of course, utterly unbothered by this. I mean, his relationship with the truth had already been disconnected by then, and he continued on his, I think with another ship actually, when he strayed into Mexican waters and fired on Mexico, and there was another court of inquiry. Now, the Church of Scientology, subsequent to the publication of my book, claimed that I'd been deceived and that this record was what they call sheep-dipped. That is to say, it was a false record that had been created to cover his true record as an undercover hero fighting in 5 theatres of war. My argument against this was on several grounds. First of all, if this was a sheep-dipped record, then it would be completely anodyne. It wouldn't have any blips in it. It wouldn't raise a single eyebrow. Instead, the record, which many documents with his signature on, very distinctive signature, is full of problems he created, full of reports saying this officer not suitable for independent command, this officer is temperamentally unsuited for this or temperamentally unsuited for that. There are letters from tailors, demanding payment for unpaid bills. So it is ridiculous, in my view, to think that anybody would have created this as a false record to cover his real record. And when I offered, after publication of the book, I did a live TV debate with members of the church, and I said, well, show me, if you've got the real record, which they claim to have, show it to me, let me see it. Of course, it never materialized. I said, you can see my record, but let me see yours. Mm-hmm. It never happened. And so I never believed for one moment that these documents I had acquired through the Freedom of Information Act were anything other than the genuine McCoy, the real thing. So there's no doubt in my mind that his record as available from the Freedom of Information Act was the real record of Hubbard's naval service, which was a disgrace, an utter disgrace. Then he then went to try and get compensation, get a pension from the Veterans Administration, and he would stagger in and out of Veterans Administration offices claiming all kinds of new problems that have been created by his war wounds, and etc., etc. Somebody said to me that the first time, an ex-Scientologist who actually said that one of the reasons that he left the church was the book, when he realised the truth about Hubbard. And the first time he read the book, he was shocked. He was absolutely appalled that to learn the truth about this man that he had revered so highly. But the second time he read it, he couldn't help but laugh about it, because actually at that level it's just a funny story. This man is a brilliant fantasist. Every time he was interviewed, they would come up with a new story, about his background. He would describe himself as a top sergeant in the Marines, as a crooner, as a Hollywood scriptwriter. Well, he may have written a couple of rejected scripts on Hollywood, but the films that he claimed credit for, his name appears nowhere in the credits of the film. So again, all utter fantasy. And I was left with some kind of admiration for Hubbard at a certain level, that he could be so utterly regardless of the truth, that he could carry on in this way, and you have to admire him for that. And when he took the organisation to sea, the famous Sea Org, who else but Hubbard would have tried to escape the various authorities pursuing me around the world by going to sea, saying, well, they can't pursue me because I'm at sea, I'm not in anybody's jurisdiction. Amazing that he would do such a thing. But the dark side, of course, was that every former Scientologist now knows about the so-called church's repressive tactics, all of these things devised originally by Hubbard himself.
Right. So when you wrote the book Barefaced Messiah, I gather you got quite a bit of harassment from, well, let's say unidentified sources.
Right. When I was in California doing research, mainly with former Scientologists, obviously the church refused any cooperation with me, so I was only able to talk to people who had been in the church and subsequently left. And one of the early interviews, somebody said to me, "Are you being followed?" I said, "No. It never occurred to me that I'd be followed." But him having asked that question, I then was a bit careful about where I was driving, and I was being followed. I was being followed every single day. I was living in a place called Chautauqua Boulevard, which is a dead-end street, so they could pick me up as I left in the morning. They could pick me up very easily. And I was followed every single day. Then my publisher started getting threatening letters threatening legal action, saying that I was an unreliable character, that several lawsuits had been filed against me for libel or slander, all of it untrue. They started to field. The first thing that happened was that they started accusing me of being responsible for unsolved crimes. So a private detective had been stabbed to death in the car park of South London, and somebody had told the police that I was responsible for that. Then a helicopter factory in the north of England had been set on fire, an arson attack, and somebody told the police that I was responsible for that. So those were the kind of things that were going on. I was told that my house was under surveillance and my telephone was being tapped and the mail was intercepted. It was very alarming for my family. I had young children at the time, and that was a worrying aspect. And then when the book came out, I was sued. I mean, everybody told me I would be sued, and I was. I mean, they took me to court in the the High Court in London, and then the Court of Appeal, and then they asked to take it to the House of Lords and were refused. We won in the High Court, we won in the Court of Appeal, and we won everywhere in Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, but in the United States, where a ferocious litigant with access to unlimited sums of money can keep a case going virtually forever. So they would sue me in this state under this law, and then another state under another law. It went up to the Supreme Court and back down again. It seemed that they would never stop, and my publisher, who fought the issue for 2 years, maybe 3 years, in the end said, "Russell, we just can't continue." The insurance company that were covering the legal costs were screaming, and this was never going to be a book that was going to make huge sums of money ever. It was a book that they badly wanted to publish, and in fact the Church of Scientology offered to buy the rights to the book, and my publisher refused. The church, I think, offered $1 million for the rights to the book, and my publisher honourably said absolutely not, because they knew that they weren't buying the rights to publish it, they were buying the rights to pulp it. But in the end, my publisher said, we can't continue. So they had to withdraw, and the book never was really published in the United States at that time, although subsequently has been. But I think 14,000 copies got out, mainly to institutions and libraries. And then they were mysteriously stolen from libraries. They would be taken out on loan and not returned. And then, then the book was then put into special issues. You had to make a special application to take it out. And then somebody was insert a loose leaf into the front of the book saying, if you want to know about Scientology, don't read this book because it's all rubbish and all lies, but read one of the official documents. So those are the kind of things that happened. And I was amazed at the extent to which they fought they fielded a lot of private detectives who tracked down pretty well every person I knew in the United States. I knew a lot of people in America. I had a lot of friends there and a lot of business colleagues there. Every person got a visit from somebody calling themselves Eugene Ingram, inquiring about me. And eventually, a private detective, Eugene Ingram, had called at an address that I'd lived in London 10 years earlier. And the neighbour was still the same neighbour that was there when I was there. And called me and said, look, who is this guy? What is he doing? But he had found out where Eugene Ingram was staying, at which hotel he was in London. So I called him. And I said, I asked for Eugene Ingram's room, and he picked up the phone, and I said, okay, you're inquiring about Russell Miller. This is Russell Miller. What do you want to know? I'll answer any questions you've got. So he sort of prevaricated, and then I said, well, actually, what precisely are you trying to prove? And he said, well, we are pretty sure that you murdered Dean Reed in Berlin, and I want to prove it. Now, Dean Reed was an American defector who had crossed over to the East, and first of all to Russia and then to East Germany. And he was a sort of pop star, a singer, an actor, and made a name for himself in the East. And I had arranged to interview him for the Sunday Times in East Berlin. And I was there at the weekend when Dean Reed tragically committed suicide. The church had found out, A, that I was in East Berlin at the time of this, that I was due to meet Dean Reed. They further found out, which was really rather spooky, that my wife was born in East Germany, coincidentally. And they put this 2 and 2 together and made 5, that Dean Reed had died in mysterious circumstances. I was there. My wife had been born in East Germany, so therefore I either worked for the Stasi or the FSB or MI6 or a combination of all 3, and that I was clearly a sinister character. It was all, of course, utter nonsense, but the way that the way their minds worked, it made perfect sense to them. So they fielded these private detectives to try and prove that I murdered Dean Reed. I mean, it all is all part of the fantasy, isn't it? The fantasy about L. Ron Hubbard is extended to a fantasy about anybody that opposes L. Ron Hubbard. I had no axe to grind ever when I started the book. I was perfectly happy to accept whatever I found. If all of the stories that Hubbard had told about himself turned out to be true, that's the book I would have written. But as virtually every story turned out to be untrue, then I couldn't write any other book than the one I did write. So I stand by the book. It was the most deeply researched book I'd ever done, because I realised that I was going to be in hot water with the church, and the church would hate it. At no time during the litigation, the extensive litigation, at no time in any court anywhere in the world did the church question what I'd written. They sued me on the basis of copyright or infringement of privacy or on technical issues. But at no time anywhere did they say this book is full of lies.
Are you going to publish the book in America again? Did I remember hearing something about that?
Yeah, the book was the original copy of the book never made it.
Could we see it?
This is the book. Yeah, this is a very rare copy of the American edition of Barefaced Messiah that never got out. So that, obviously I've got one myself. But recently an independent publisher in this country did bring out a second edition, exactly the same as that, and we anticipated there would be difficulty, but there was none. So that book is readily available in the United States, same title, Barefaced Messiah, different publisher, but you can find it anywhere on the web or order it through the web. I think that the church probably had enough. They got nowhere with the first litigation. They were unable to prove that I was a unreliable or bad person, and that the book was full of lies. Well, it's not, and so I think they thought, well, it's easier to let it go and not make a fuss about it, because by suing me they would only give me extra publicity. And indeed, the book has been available on the net in its entirety from the start. So anybody who wanted to read it on the net could do so.
you mentioned that your book was extensively researched. How many people did you actually, approximately, did you speak to regarding Hubbard?
I spoke to probably 20 or 30 disaffected Scientologists. Principal among them was Jerry Armstrong, who, as you know, was designated as the official biographer of Hubbard while he was still in the church. And it was Armstrong who started riffling through the records and realised that the things that had been said about Hubbard were not true. And all he wanted to do was set the record straight, Armstrong. But the minute he said, look, the minute he suggested that the stories that had been told about Hubbard were not true, then he was declared a suppressive person and persecuted in a way that only the church knows how, and was sued and pursued through the courts, and I believe still is. Now his legal action, he left the church and took away with him vital documents. One of them was Hubbard's childhood diary, and a lot of other documents too, and then the church sued to try and get them back. But in that process, those documents went on the court record, so they became, in effect, public documents, and I felt no compunction about using them. As far as I was concerned, they were public record. The church disagreed, and in the end the court sided with me in the United Kingdom. So Armstrong was a very important source. John Atack was also a very important source. He had created a huge archive of material which he generously made available to me. One last thing, and that is, in many regards, Hubbard was an actor, and he was a very good one too, because after the war, when he was trying to improve his pension, he stumbled into offices, pretending to be lame or nearly blind, that he couldn't see anything, and people were taken in by this. Although they never actually discovered anything physically wrong with him, apart from an ulcer, he convinced them that he suffered from this multitude of ailments, all connected with his war service, and throughout the war service, everyone he met, and I found a lot of them. I tracked down a lot of them. He came up with different stories. He'd meet this chap and say, oh, he was more or less blind in one eye because a shell had exploded as he picked it up and threw it off the deck, or he was crippled because some other fantastic incident on another ship. He was an actor and a fantasist at the same time, and a very convincing one. And he, in the end, when the Veterans Administration despaired, they couldn't find anything wrong with it. He created more ailments. It just went on and on. It never ended. He was, in that regard, an astonishing individual.